Okay. Good morning, and welcome back to the second day of the FTC's data security hearings. My name is Jared Ho, and I'm an attorney with the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection. Today, you will hear from panelists on the topics of data security assessments, the U.S. approach to security, and FTC data security enforcement. We will also feature a fireside chat between FTC Commissioner Slaughter and Joshua Corman from I Am the Cavalry. Before we get started, I just need to remind everyone of a few housekeeping matters. First, please silence your cell phones and other electronic handheld devices. Please be aware that if you leave the Constitution Center building, you'll have to go back through security training. Most of you have received a lanyard with a plastic FTC security badge. We reuse those, so please be sure to leave them with security on your way out at the end of the day. If an emergency occurs that requires you to leave the conference center but remain in the building, please follow the instructions provided over the building's PA system. If an emergency occurs that requires an evacuation of the building, an alarm will sound. Everyone should leave the building in an orderly manner through the main 7th Street exit. After leaving the building, you'll turn left, proceed down 7th Street, across East Street to the FTC Emergency Assembly Area. Remain in that area until instructed to return to the building. If you notice any suspicious activity, please alert building security. Please be advised that this event may be photographed, webcast, or recorded. By participating in this event, you're agreeing that your image and anything you say or submit may be posted indefinitely at ftc.gov or one of the FTC's publicly available sites. Question cards are available in the hallway on the information table immediately outside the conference room. Event staff will be available to collect your question cards. For those of you participating via webcast, you can tweet using the hashtag FTC hearings. Restrooms are located in the hallway outside the auditorium. Now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Lisa Gilson and Jim Trilling, who will be moderating the first panel of the day on data security assessments. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared, and good morning, everyone. During the hearing, we have heard about some of the common attack vectors involved in data breaches and some of the challenges that businesses face in addressing them. This panel will discuss data security assessments and the ways that they can help businesses address those challenges. We have an outstanding panel that includes professionals from the data security, insurance, and accounting sectors. Their bios are available in hard copy outside the hearing room and also online for those of you who are viewing the webcast. In order, we have Malcolm Harkins, the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cylance, Inc., Carolyn Holcomb, a partner at PwC, Troy Leach, the Chief Technology Officer at the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council, Tom McAndrew, the CEO of Coalfire, Wendy Nather, the Head of Advisory CISOs at Duo Security, which is now Cisco, and Garen Pace, the Cyber Product Leader at American International Group, which you may know as AIG. We will use a series of hypotheticals to help guide this particular panel discussion, and we're going to go straight into the first hypo. Company A was a startup 10 years ago with an innovative rent-a-pet model. The company now has over 150 employees in 3 locations. The company had no security personnel per se at first, and then hired a few IT jack-of-all-trades to handle aspects of security. The founder has now hired a CISO for the first time. How should the CISO assess the company's security at this point in time? How should the CISO stay on top of the company's security? Before we jump into the specific questions posed in the hypo, I want to start off with a few basics. Tom, security assessments can encompass a range of tests or analyses, such as vulnerability assessments, penetration tests, and black box tests. How should businesses use each of those tools?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different tests that organizations use in assessing security, and each one of them have their pros and cons. There's kind of a spectrum of technical tests, going to business tests, and risk analysis. Typical tests, many organizations start with penetration testing. It's a way of basically seeing what the adversary might see out there, what your digital footprint looks like, and it can be a very cost-effective way of looking from the outside of what an attacker may see. Some of the limitations of something like a penetration test is it may not be able to get to what we call the GUI inside. So it may have a great hard shell on the outside of the business. There might be a lot of things wrong on the inside. A lot of times you'll balance that then with some internal testing or internal organizations that may use different knowledge of the environment. This can include doing some basic reconnaissance or knowing how the organization is designed, where the crown jewels are, and giving some guidance to assess where that risk is. I think the key here is to know that there isn't really one silver bullet in any of these tests. They all have different limitations. They all have different effectiveness and cost models. And the key is really to balance the types of tests that organizations are doing with the risks and the levels of assurance that they'd like to provide back to their business managers, stakeholders, and consumers.
Thank you. Carolyn, what published standards do assessors use when conducting data security assessments?
Yeah, sure. There are a number of published standards to use, and I think it is critical that a standard be used both internally and externally. So, for example, in this hypo number 1, the CISO would want to use something like an ISO framework or maybe the NIST cybersecurity. You could use the Carnegie Mellon maturity model. Those would all be very useful in determining how do our risks look, how mature is our security organization. Those can be used, like I said, internally. They can also be used by an outside assessor to understand how strong the security is. And it's important to use one of those so that it's really complete. When you really want a leg to stand on and say, hey, I've really done a thorough assessment, it's important to use one of those well-known, publicly available, tried and true frameworks. So those are some good examples of ones to use.
Malcolm, some observers have expressed concern that some assessors do not add much value and some peddle products that may offer little benefit. How can a company find quality security products and assessors?
Well, I think we have to start first by looking at the fact that the current model we have is inefficient and ineffective. We're throwing bodies at the problem, and it doesn't scale, it's not full scope. And some of the assessment techniques also point to, in some cases written into the standards, dated technology that we know doesn't work. So I think when a chief security officer starts to look at that, they have to evaluate the economic incentives and the model with which they engage a supplier. Do they make more money because of the continued pain and problems that I have and the impact to my company? Or are they incentivized to actually make sure that I get to a better level of permanent security? Now, the other aspect of these things that I have to think about, and we talked about pen testing and all that, but if I was coming into this hypothetical, my first thing would be to go do a compromise assessment. A pen test is checking if somebody can get in. I want to know who's already in there because they didn't have security people to begin with. So I have to understand where compromise has already occurred, fix that, understand how they got in, remediate those problems, and then from there I have a clean slate from which to build on.
You raise an interesting point about the incentives. So on one hand, you could see value in having a repeat assessor relationship because that assessor begins to know the business and so can build on knowledge over years of relationship with that company. On the other hand, if you have a different assessor each time, perhaps you have better incentives because you aren't the assessor won't be looking to get next year's business as well, and you get true independence. At least that's one perspective. What are your thoughts on that, the repeat relationship versus an independent look each time?
The repeat relationship certainly gives you a level of efficiency on both sides of it, but I do think you have to look at different assessment techniques and then to go through a pattern of changing the assessors. We all have individual biases, just like every framework has a bias. And that bias then will lead you to conclusions that will leave you with blind spots. And what we've continued to have in the cybersecurity space is too many blind spots. And so for me, there's a diversity and a rotation aspect to not only the approaches you take for the assessments, but who you use for the assessments, whether they be internally or externally, because you're going to get then a different perspective and a different interpretation of the results.
Maybe just to highlight, if I may, one point I think, Malcolm, you started on a little bit, is the different types. So doing the compromise assessment and a controls assessment and a framework assessment and an attack and penetration. So maybe just to emphasize that a little bit, I think it's really critical that those all be used at different times because they'll all give you different results and different insights so that you can try to avoid those blind spots.
Can we unpack that a little bit? So what is entailed in doing a compromise assessment and tying it to this specific hypo, which we've laid out as a company that may not have quite as mature of a security program as some others? What would a compromise assessment entail?
Well, I think, again, there's a variety of ways which you can do it. There's some in the industry that do it by throwing bodies at it, and they send people in to go inspect all the systems. Again, that's a highly manual process. It's cost-intensive, and it takes a long time. There's other approaches where you can utilize artificial intelligence, machine learning. You can give a small organization certain scripts to run in their environments. It collects the data off of those systems. It then brings that back, and you can use automation then to figure out where a foothold may have been gained and where lateral movement may have occurred and turn those things around in days so that you can start then, if there's been a compromise, in remediating that issue.
And if I can add to that, I think one of the, we did some analysis, did some surveys across our customer base, about 1,500 different folks, and a common issue, particularly in this hypothetical, is while I agree that AI and machine learning, all this stuff is happening, most of these organizations that are pretty small generally have a similar profile in that they're just starting to kind of integrate technology. You tend to have IT or a CISO-centric view in a smaller organization, which is about getting more technology and building out what they need to do. But we find is it's basic cyber hygiene. So in basic organizations, we're typically going to find that they're not doing basic patch management, they don't have asset inventory, they don't know some of the basics and some of the advanced items, and they don't know what they need to protect. And so what we would encourage before you throw bodies or technology or people at it, start with the baseline of really understanding how the business operates, what are the risks you're trying to address, and go down that path. So just like in a financial audit, you wouldn't go and throw a bunch of auditor technology to go identify if there's fraud or if certain things are happening. Same thing in technology. Before you go down that rat hole, look at some of the basics, and it may be more efficient to spend more time getting some of the cyber hygiene and getting some of the automation in place before you get another report of all the items that need to be fixed.
And I could probably add to that because this particular hypo, I actually managed an organization that was about 150 employees, and just recall myself being able to discover in my first day on the job that no one knew where the information was flowing. So being in PCI Council, in our standards, we always say requirement 0 is being able to identify where all this information is. Typically, when we see data breaches, many times the organization thought they were protecting the right assets, had the right number of bodies and the right technology in place, only to discover they just didn't do the right risk assessment to evaluate and understand where the data was flowing to begin with. So I think it does start with that type of assessment of understanding not only where the data is, but as Carolyn said about some of those frameworks, like the cybersecurity framework for NIST, it helps identify the value and the risk for each type of asset that might be flowing through your information.
The one thing, though, that systemically we all tend to miss, and I've seen this over and over again, is the assessment models are looked at in terms of risk to me, risk to my organization, which we need to do in order to manage our fiduciary accountabilities. But in too many cases, we're not looking at the risk to our customers or the societal risk. Now, in this hypothetical pet example, you can aggregate probably 2 macro risks: the revenue risk of not having the rent-a-pet model happen, and then the risk that would incur to the organization. Or you could look at it in terms of the information you're collecting on the people who are renting pets and the potential risk to them if you manage it wrong. And too frequently, the organizations that are responsible for managing risk are looking at risk to themselves, not the risk that they're creating for others. And that's also a common failing of the frameworks that we have.
Wendy, I think you wanted to weigh in, and I have a specific follow-up question for you as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was actually one of these CISOs who was hired for the first time for more than one organization. So I know the feeling of staring at an empty Excel spreadsheet and wondering where to start. I agree absolutely with Tom that these sorts of basics of how the company manages IT need to be looked at, but just because they're called basic or they're fundamental doesn't necessarily mean they're easy. If anybody looked at the Equifax report that just came out, one of the problems that led to the eventual breach was that their certificates, one of their certificates had expired. So certificate management would not necessarily be the first thing you would think of for cyber hygiene, but it's incredibly important. Another thing is that, according to one person who analyzed the report, the person who was scanning for the struts vulnerability did not use the right flags in the command for scanning, so they were only scanning the top level directory. And therefore, yes, the scan probably finished very quickly and didn't find what they were trying to find. So it's that sort of thing that needs to be looked at above and beyond what the cyber hygiene standards are. It's all about how the company manages its IT.
Jim, if I may, I just wanted to add one other thing to the idea of that first security assessment. And then I heard Tom mention, make sure we meet the risk with the appropriate amount of mitigation. And I think just understanding the threat model is also important. Another panelist said, make sure that we understand what risks we're trying to prevent. That's a larger part of not just maybe the maturity assessment, their framework, are they using the right controls, but are the controls they're thinking about, are they appropriate for the risks they're likely to have? What is their peer group? What kind of threats are their peers see? And making sure they build that into their risk assessment, where their business will be impacted. Obviously, in this hypothetical scenario, it seems like the ability to take payments and find those customers who wish to rent a pet are important. But just knowing what are the business, the assets that impact the business the most, and what are the likely risks to befall them, I think is sometimes a lost starting point. At AIG, we often see clients who are in the process of purchasing cyber insurance, and they're worried about threats that aren't necessarily the first threats they should be worried about, and that can be frustrating.
Along those lines, Wendy, in what way do assessments take into account characteristics such as the size of the business, its maturity, the type of the business, and as Malcolm highlighted, the types of data that the business may be collecting?
That's actually a really complex question, and the problem is that even peer organizations don't necessarily face the same IT risks. In one of the Verizon data breach investigation reports, they determined that within the banking industry, smaller to mid-sized banks actually did not share the same risk profile as larger banks. They had more risks in common with retail. So you actually need to slice your data in many different ways to look at how old the organization is, and that determines how much legacy technology they also need to bring into their security program, whether they're geographically dispersed, whether they're publicly or privately owned, and who their aspirational role models are, not just what their peers are doing in security, because sometimes their peers are not doing a great job in security. They need to look at who they want to be like. And I know that doesn't necessarily work for a hardcore security assessment, but it's something that companies should be taking into account, especially when they're starting with zero, as in this hypothetical. They can only go up from here. The question is, in which way and with which priorities do they want to build their cybersecurity portfolio?
So in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the second hypo, but I want to keep some parts of the first one in mind. So actually, let's go back to the first. So here we were talking about something of a novice company, a startup that was coming into maturity. Hypo 2 deals with a mature company. So Company B is a mature company with an internal audit department, a large security staff, and a CISO who reports to the board. It plans to obtain new cyber insurance. How should the CISO, the board, and the prospective cyber insurers assess the company's security? What types of information will prospective insurers request from Company B to assess its data security risks? And this time, I'd like to just hand the hypo over to you and let you tackle these tough questions with one more intro question, and that is, what is the difference in the context of data security between an audit and an assessment, and when should the audit or the assessment be internal versus external? And I leave that open to you all.
I'll start with a couple comments. I think, so an audit is really to provide financial statement users. It's defined by the AICPA. It's generally accepted accounting principles or international financial reporting standards. So that really is what an audit is all about, whereas these would be assessments. So if we're going to look at what is going on in security, we will start with an assessment. And so that would be the primary difference there. An assessment is not defined in standards, so rather it's defined by the user or, in the FTC's cases, in the FTC orders. The orders really define what an assessment is looking for. Specifically in a few areas, it talks about has to be performed independently, it has to be performed using standards, which we've talked about a little bit, and then it also has to be, as Jim just said, based on the complexity of the business, the size, the maturity, the type of business, the type of data, all that has to be taken into account. And I think in this example, I think the best way to go about this is using the 3 lines of defense. If you're familiar with that, the first line of defense really is the security team plus the business. So everyone who's responsible kind of on the front lines for security. That needs to be communicated, directed, clear, what the policies are, the procedures, the standards, the controls. So that's your first line of defense here. The second line, since we've got a nice mature company here, the second line is the risk management function, which will look at risks holistically across the organization. So risk and compliance and legal, those functions all teaming together to say security risk is one of the risks that the organization faces. How does that fit in with the rest of the risks that we have, the compliance risks and the legal risks, and putting that all together. And then your third line of defense is the internal audit function. Not all companies have that, but in this hypo, the company does. So that third line of defense now makes sure that that's all fit together, it's working well. The internal audit group, in fact, all 3 lines of defense will report to the board. All right, that would really be the leading practice, is to have reports that go to the board from all 3 lines talking about security as well as other risks. So I'll stop there.
I'll add to that. Looking at assessors versus auditors, I think one thing that we encourage for PCI, we qualify assessors. And the idea there is that they're more coaches and teachers rather than the enforcement. And sometimes it's very hard to do that because for audits, you need to have a metric to which you measure yourself and be able to demonstrate that you've achieved some level of security for your third parties in that assurance. But for the assessors, the hope is both internal and external, that they're not only looking at the problem itself, but they're looking at what are different solutions to the same problem. So typically, if we look at where we were 5, 10 years ago or later, we were just trying to throw more security, as Malcolm said earlier, more people at the problem, rather than can we change the problem. So in the payment space in particular, that's what we've been looking at is there ways for us to devalue what the asset is. So can we create things that are proxies for valuable information? So instead of an account number that could be lost, could we have a dynamic token that replaces what a criminal could steal and then use for fraud? I think the internal versus external is a critical partnership, actually, where the external is looking at have you met this metric so that you can demonstrate these security functions are working properly for your trusted third parties or partners, whereas the internal assessor can maintain that the integrity of the process continues and that security becomes a part of the culture. It's a business as usual practice. And we've seen that quite a bit in just the maturity of organizations to have those security security champions within each department within these larger type enterprises, so that you're not coming to a PCI or HIPAA or SOX or whatever compliance requirement that you're facing and having to scramble to meet a milestone of just having met some type of expectation, but you're continually measuring to that line. And there's organizations that out there that have done studies on this that demonstrate that those organizations that are committed to that type of internal assessments are actually saving their overall compliance and governance budget considerably. The Poneman Institute put out a study now several years old, but that they're looking at PCI compliance specifically, and internal assessments that were done 2 to 3 times throughout the year were actually saving the organization about 55% on their entire budget because they were not deviating that much throughout the year.
The one thing that I think in this hypothetical, though, we're missing, and the false conclusion that I think many people jump to, is the fact that a mature company therefore has the appropriate and mature information security program with the right controls. Just look at the Marriott breach, Anthem, Target, Home Depot, OPM, on and on and on. Organizations that have been around for decades that on one measure would say are mature. So why is it then that they're getting compromised left and right? And so I think we have to not assume that a mature company actually has adequate controls. And in my view, the way in which these assessments should be done is to look at the control effectiveness. We need to understand the root cause of what control failed and then figure out how to improve those controls. If we start doing that, we'll actually drive a level of real maturation in our control designs and then drive the right level of accountability back to the organizations as well as the solution providers who, in some cases, sold solutions that didn't work.
That's a nice segue to another question that's posed by this hypo about cyber insurance. So one view is that cyber insurers potentially have that kind of data about controls because they are looking across the industry. So Garen, could you speak to that? Do cyber insurers accumulate data that would enable them to gauge the efficacy of certain controls? And in this hypo in particular, how would a cyber insurer go about assessing this company's security?
Let me start with the second question because I think it'll impact the first. The information requirements for cyber insurance, 15, 20 years ago when cyber insurance was first offered, they were actually probably the highest they've ever been. Insurance is a market, and we saw the information requirements necessary to be offered cyber insurance actually fall. The past few years, they've actually been on the way back up, but some of my co-panelists worked for insurers to help assess companies' security posture before cyber insurance was offered, and some of my co-panelists still do that. But I think that they would agree that the most rigorous assessment, boots on the ground, several days with a security assessor with a lot of experience, was something that was only done in the beginning. We're seeing information requirements go back up. For a lot of the reasons I think Wendy mentioned, the information requirements will vary depending on the amount of coverage being offered, the size of the company, the industry of the company, and the type of assets they have. Obviously, someone who's taking credit cards, there are a specific set of questions that we're going to ask about how they protect those assets. But generally, the requirements for insurance are going to ask, what is the governance model? Who is responsible for information security? What type of sensitive information do you collect and how much? Information that helps the insurer understand the maximum potential loss. And then again, what is their control effectiveness? What are their control capabilities? And how likely is the organization to detect and hopefully stop any type of incident from happening?
And I'll add that and this is an exciting field where a lot of things are changing right now. The common mistake that we've seen is typically, from the experience we've seen, the purchasers of these insurance typically come from the CFO or finance group as they're running the business, and a lot of times they may send the CISO or an IT manager a survey to fill out, and that's the extent of it. And then what we find is post-breach or post-incident, and they look at their insurance coverage, they realize that it only covered a certain amount, or as Malcolm mentioned, like in some cases, they don't realize the entire risk that they had or what could have happened. So one of the things that we really encourage folks to do is, cyber insurance is a form of risk mitigation or transferring that risk. It's not a CFO function. It's not a CEO function. It really is a business function, and it's important to get everybody together. The second part that's really happening here is the technology and the technology enablement to get smarter about this. So, an annual assessment or sending people in or a one-time technology really is a point in time and provides some basic data, but you will see, in my opinion, over the next couple of years, much more ways to get automated data of, like we mentioned, some of the basic cyber hygiene to make sure that things are happening the right way in this model. And I think, there's a good point of, in this organization being a mature company, right? We like saying that, security is a journey, it's not an endpoint. And so organizations must constantly, shuffle around where their investments are in tools, technologies, people, process. And like Troy said, one of the biggest things that people can do is change their business model, go through a digital transformation. We had one organization that had 1,000 different locations, that each one of those locations replicated millions and millions of sensitive information. And the tools and technology may tell you to encrypt it, to spend more information on, to protect it, but a little architecture design eliminated all that data and outsourced all that data or moved into a different area where they could focus on that. So there's kind of a balance that's happening right now of, is it better to disperse your data and manage a larger group, hoping that that's a better way of managing security through obscurity, or is it better to know where your data is and spend and concentrate more information on that? And that's where really, today, where the industry is going to right now, which is don't have your data in so many different pockets, minimize that, and over-invest into those areas.
So I want to build on two things Tom said and then come back to your first question about how insurance might be able to help this improve control efficacy. So first, several insurers are using some of these lightweight external outside-in scans to try and get more objective views and assess cyber hygiene. That's a good thing. I think the challenge is that, I agree with you that the cyber risk is fast evolving. If you look at insurance policies, they're generally written on an annual basis, sometimes even longer periods, and it can be tough to, particularly some of the regulatory reasons, to move that model to something where we're going to price risk more frequently. But nevertheless, there's a lot of development being made there. Back to the idea of can insurers help with control efficacy, it's linked to those information requirements. The more insurers know about what a company looked like before something went wrong, and then understanding what happened, what went wrong, and also understanding what did the companies look like who didn't have something go wrong, the more we can say these are the controls that matter. And I mentioned earlier that the amount of information requirements necessary to get cyber insurance reached their low approximately 4 or 5 years ago, and have been on the uptick since, but the insurance market needs better information to be able to analyze and then turn around to our insureds and say, these are the controls that matter. And I think that we are doing that, and I think that's part of the reason why the insurance market, I know my own company is doing that, why we're asking more questions and we're doing more analysis. But it'll be hard to do that because there was a period in the cyber insurance market where famously some insurers were offering insurance on the backing of 4 questions. We're not going to give good efficacy about these are the controls which stop the most common types of risks, or these are the controls which, if done this way, fail if we're only asking a handful of questions.
So going back to the question about whether internal or external assessments should be used and when, obviously the answer is both, because external assessments or point-in-time assessments can often turn into a catch-me-if-you-can game. And that plays right into the way that some companies look at cyber risk, which is kind of the way that you think about how you're going to eat cheeseburgers until your first heart attack and then you're going to stop. And this kind of cheeseburger risk management is unfortunately pretty widespread today. And the other problem is that you cannot stop eating cheeseburgers and go on a vegan diet 2 weeks before your doctor's appointment. That's just not how it works. So in order for these companies to make a lifestyle change in their security assessment, they need to be self-assessing as well as getting external assessments, but also making a fundamental change in how they manage their day-to-day operations and their security, so that it doesn't turn into a studying to the test scenario. It's actually a fundamental change in how they manage security every day.
One other thing, just as a quick comment for assessors, for folks to consider, the assessment process itself actually poses a risk to an organization. If the assessor finds issues in your environment, finds vulnerabilities, and they're doing it in aggregate for multiple companies, they're a target. Because if I'm a bad guy and I can compromise the assessor, I then know all the nooks and crannies of where there's controlled deficiencies in their customers. So we have to also think about that as organizations, and as the chief security officer, when people assess me, particularly externally, I see them as a risk, and I need to assess their ability to manage and protect that data. And we've certainly seen assessors get compromised.
With that, we're going to move on to the third hypo. So Company C is a mid-sized firm that has long struggled with patch management and third-party vendor relationships. It hires a new CISO who wants to understand the scope of these problems and of the company's security generally. How should the CISO assess the security situation? How are these persistent problems relevant to Company C's ability to obtain cyber insurance? So for this one, let's go straight into the questions in the hypo, beginning with how should the CISO assess the security situation at Company C?
I'll start with the third-party piece, maybe, to break this down a little bit. So vendor relationships, that's a big risk these days. As you've seen, Malcolm mentioned some of the breaches that have been caused by third parties. So the first thing there really is to understand, what's the governance program? Do we have somebody or a group of people responsible for vendor risk management? So who's that? How are they doing it? How are they understanding what the risks are? Number two, back to understanding what data you have, is understanding what vendors we have. We certainly find a lot of organizations that really don't have that full inventory together, really don't know all their vendor relationships, what data those vendors have, whether they're in the system or receiving data, what that flow looks like. Then you go down to the contract level. Do we understand what the contract language is? When does a vendor have to tell us that they suspect a breach? When does a vendor have to have strong security and privacy controls? Do we understand what those are? After we get through the contract, then it's real monitoring and understanding what those controls actually look like. So assessing your vendors, putting them in tiers. Leading practices to put your vendors in tiers according to risk. In the old days, that used to be financial risk. Tom mentioned, sometimes the CFO is doing these types of analysis, and so you might have vendors only assessed according to how much you pay them, when in fact it really should be what is the data that they collect and how do they get it? What's the means of obtaining that data? Then once they're in those tiers, it's understanding, now what are we going to do? Are we going to go on site and do assessments? Are we going to do questionnaires? How often? Twice a year, once every 2 years? There are all sorts of permutations, but it's really understanding, putting a whole program together around these third parties and making sure that they're monitored in an ongoing way.
To add to what Carolyn said, and I think, again, we jump as CISOs to thinking about just the security risks. There's privacy risks, there's business continuity and disaster risks, depending upon, where they fit in your supply chain and what operations they're supporting your organization. So you have to widen it out. And then, transitioning to the patching stuff, when I assess patching is both a hygiene item for managing risk, but patching also poses a risk, because you're adding code or taking away code. So you're creating a change, which creates an operational risk. And so we have to think of patching not as a panacea. It's a good thing to do, but in many cases, patching can actually generate equal or greater risk to a business.
So I just want to, maybe I'll address the insurance question and then build on that. Obviously, the applicants for insurance cannot misrepresent the risk. And today, most cyber insurance markets are going to ask questions about the company's patching strategy and their cadence for doing so, because it is, obviously important to the risk. They want to understand, for instance, their ability to inventory their software and consistently patch, and then in the event of some type of assessment of a particularly impactful vulnerability, do an out-of-band patch. So it's going to be something that's asked about by the insurer, and I would expect, from my experience, a company who has in the past had trouble patching regularly, who has a lot of end-of-life systems, they should expect to pay a higher premium and get less favorable terms. That said, it is not an absolute exclusion. There are plenty of companies out there who are still rocking XP and have cyber insurance. They pay a higher premium. They should expect to have more questions about their compensating controls for that risk, but coverage is there.
And to add on, I think, so there's three, this is the third scenario that we've done now. And what I like about this, we started with a very small one, then we did a large organization, this is the mid-size. We did some research into this to look at were there some common issues or strengths or weaknesses across the sorts of customers that we support. And we did find that actually the mid-size organizations actually were the best. We're in kind of the sweet spot, Goldilocks zone of patch management. And the reason, so if this is the case, then it's probably a bad thing for this organization, because we typically find that smaller organizations don't have the resources, they're dealing with lots of technology, they haven't figured out to integrate it. The medium-sized organizations have really optimized that the most as they're trying to figure it out. The large organizations, like Malcolm said, have it's harder to change, they have more interdependencies, they have legacy software. So we typically find these medium organizations are more agile and able to do some of the hygiene a little bit better. On the flip side, what we find is they're more vulnerable to phishing attempts because they don't have the policy and some of the other areas that a more mature organization may have, like with badging and some of the background checks. So I think the key part for this scenario is to realize maybe the patch management is a big risk. Maybe the third-party vendor management is a big risk. Maybe there's a business model risk. There is no one answer, but hopefully the CISO that's come into this organization is going to bring some background, and the key is to make sure that's integrated into what the business challenges are and how they want to manage their overall cyber assurance.
We can also look at the problem with patching as an ongoing symptom of the complexity of the IT of that organization, because in general, if you don't understand all of the stacks and layers of technology that you have, you're not sure what's going to happen when you patch, or there are so many dependencies that it's hard to figure out, like a Jenga tower, which piece you're going to start pulling out first before everything falls down around you. So looking at the complexity of that IT environment and trying to simplify it, as well as improving the overall management, is the underlying root cause that could probably help with the patching problem when it's under that organization's control. When the organization is small or not influential and isn't able to influence the patching schedule of software that it bought from companies that are now out of business, or XP that is out of life, or for equipment that was never intended to be patched, then it's in a much more difficult situation. And I think that's something where we can look on a larger level about how we can address that type of patching problem.
Can I follow up on those points, Wendy, and circle back to some of what Carolyn said at the outset when talking about the third-party vendors, focusing on the company in this particular hypo being a mid-sized firm. Are there additional lessons for this type of company beyond what Carolyn mentioned in terms of thinking about how to manage the risk of dealing with vendors that may be much larger than this particular company?
Yeah, I can start with that because to what the fellow panelists talking about dependencies, when you start in the mid-size firm, I agree with what Tom was saying, that small businesses are still trying to do it in-house, and by the time they're a mature enterprise, that they have some of their third-party relationships and those contracts figured out. But for the mid-size organizations and a lot of the breaches, as Carolyn mentioned earlier, and also Malcolm, we're seeing that these third-party dependencies is a growing high percentage of the risk. And so the challenge is, and we talked about questionnaires earlier, is how much do you trust your third party actually understands and knows the risk associated with your business. And we've seen, especially in the cloud services area, we've seen a lot of assumptions that the third party that is managing, whether it's the infrastructure or the software, whatever it might be, there's an assumption that that organization is doing all the things to protect my assets, my information, and that's processing through their environment. And the challenge we've seen in some of the compromises or just in general assessments being done is when they start to dig beyond just a questionnaire, they start to identify that, oh, my third party was PCI compliant, for example, but they were PCI compliant because they also process payments and they had an evaluation against their processing environment, not the processing environment that runs on that platform for my services. So I do think that the due diligence of third parties and managing that relationship starts to become critical for these mid-size that for the first time are starting to outsource and trust these third parties to manage those exercises for them.
That's a great point, especially on the scope of the PCI, Troy, like you're alluding to there. Because one thing that a mid-size can do, if your vendor is the large company, then they typically have SOC 2 type reports, something from a third party that could give you some assurance. So on one hand, that can be really helpful because you can look at that and say, okay, did that third party independently assess that large vendor's security and privacy? But the same as what Troy said, you have to look at the scope and you have to be careful. Did it actually include my data at the right time, on the right systems? What were the findings? What were the exceptions? You really want to scrutinize that report and make sure it is useful. But it's certainly a good way for the big vendors because all the big cloud vendors get those. Most of the big organizations will get those, which is helpful to a mid-size.
The one thing that I think we also have to think about that I think, again, people tend to focus on is they'll think of the IT vendors, the data vendors. And the vendor risk management program should be all vendors. Your lawyer presents a risk to you. Your accountant presents a risk to you. The cleaning crew that comes in, if you have sensitive data and you have people leaving it on the desk and you don't have a shredding program for that data, presents a risk to you. So it has to be systemically across, in essence, all the vendors, including the ones that might be managing the industrial control systems going into a factory or the water coming in. Because again, all those present risk. They're all getting connected to devices that could be then compromised in a cyber fashion or compromised in a physical fashion, like picking up sensitive documents off of somebody's desk and taking pictures of them. So we have to think about the vendor risk management much more broadly than I think typically people are focused on in the IT space.
That's the point I wanted to make, to add on to the idea of, yes, a vendor might be able to manage a piece of software with more expertise than you can manage. Certainly there's some cloud providers out there who provide software suites and they are the experts in assessing the security of it and keeping it up to date. But I think as maybe as Malcolm mentioned, there's also a business continuity risk and there's certainly a reputation risk. Your customers aren't necessarily gonna understand when you say, well, it was cloud provider's fault. And there's also the idea that a certain amount of aggregation and a potential lack of diversity and more complexity does create potentially more risk when you look at an entire cloud region going out. So from an insurance point of view, when you're looking at the vendor, doing that vendor risk assessment, there's some benefits, but I think they also need to make sure we take note of the potential risks and that you are entrusting your business's ability to run on that other vendor. It's a dependency, and there's also you can't outsource that liability to your customers and that reputation risk.
In the interest of time, we're going to move on now to the next hypo. Company D starts processing payment cards for the first time. How should the company assess its risk on day one of payment processing and going forward? And Troy, maybe you can start us off with this one.
And I think it goes to some of the principles we've already talked about. Hopefully, by day one, they've already done quite a bit of analysis as to how they're going to be processing payments and how that is going to be, what organization departments are going to be touching that information. And also, they've done due diligence. Most likely, they're using third parties for at least part of this processing. They're looking to see if those, the terminals themselves, the point-of-sale terminals, or whatever mechanism they're using to accept the cards are going through laboratory assessment. So at the PCI Council, we're probably more known for the PCI DSS standard for assessing the environment, but a majority of our standards are actually technical standards for the vendors that provide all of the technology, whether it's the payment cards themselves or the point-of-sale terminals. And so hopefully they've done their due diligence to research to make sure that the technology they're using is being done in a way that is lab evaluated, hopefully through a PCI certified lab. They also are looking at how they installed it. Probably the biggest thing, especially for small merchants, we don't know the size of Company D, but if we were to assume it's a small to mid-sized company, one of the biggest challenges we see is they think that just plugging in a terminal is a very simple act. And we've seen, especially in the small to medium-sized businesses, they bring in someone that has no technical payment security experience, and what they'll do is they'll plug in the terminal and say, you know what, I cannot connect to my home office, so I'm going to disable the small merchant's firewall. And then all of a sudden, the terminal can communicate and process. So you have to have someone that understands the payment, and hopefully by day one, they're looking to make sure that they have technology that is currently certified, but they're also using people that are trained specifically in payment processing and the security associated with it.
And could we focus in particular on the risk on day one versus the risk going forward? So is the PCI assessment a point-in-time assessment? What does that mean, and what does that mean for security on day two when the assessment has focused at that point in time on day one?
So I can speak to the PCI assessment a little bit, but I'll probably turn to my colleague Tom that's seen thousands of these at this point in his career. For the risk assessment for the PCI DSS standard, it's really matured over the last 12 to 14 years since its creation. And the intent has always been that there is continuous process of securing the payment information, and that the assessment that is done is, while it might be a point in time, say 3 weeks, 2-week assessment, it is actually, the intent is that it's evaluating the process so that when the assessor leaves that environment, 3, 4, 5 months, as the technology and the personnel change probably multiple times in that time, they have an opportunity to continue to have good security hygiene throughout that processing environment. So for the key, if a company is looking to add payment processing for the first time and maintain that level of high degree to a PCI DSS evaluation, what they really need to have is security champions throughout the organization, not just isolated into an IT department, as Malcolm was talking about earlier, but there are security and payment security champions throughout the organization that understand the risk and the reason why they go about doing those type of assessments. Tom, I don't know.
Yeah, so as Troy mentioned, I think one of the key parts on this is in the beginning, and we ran this outcome, there was a misunderstanding of just fundamentally how credit card processing or what sensitive data needed. So for example, most organizations don't ever need to actually see a credit card number. Right, the reason they're processing, they're not in the business of collecting credit card information and building repositories. They're in the business of selling products and getting paid. And I remember working in the very beginning, we would ask people, why do they have millions and millions of historic numbers or all these receipts? And some of them had a misunderstanding. They said they needed that for chargebacks or they needed that for X. And so one key part, as Troy mentioned earlier, is that the technology is changing very quickly, particularly in this space, from mobile to web. And so it's important that as this organization organization goes, they're aware of what they're doing. Otherwise, they might be putting all their protection on a terminal, and in this case, maybe everybody is copying those numbers when the systems go and they're putting them into a database. Very typically, we find other systems like marketing or other areas where they want information for their consumers to get information, and they're capturing that, and they really don't need it. So one of the key items for here is to make sure that whatever they are retaining moving forward, they really understand what that is, and that should be part of their PCI assessment to make sure that that continues to go. One of the best things I think we can do is on assessors is to minimize that risk, right? Ask them, why do you have 10 years? Do you really need 3 months? Do you need 6 months? Look at the data. What percentage of chargebacks do you have, and is the risk that you have of keeping this worth the liability or potential liability you have? And a second part we find is, and this is I think where some of the, as we come in from PCI or some other areas that you're providing some assurance of this process, it's very common we find that PCI is just one of 10 or 20 different types of sensitive information they're keeping. They're keeping social security numbers, they're keeping driver's license, they're keeping passports. So this then generally balloons into something larger to say what is the business model and how they're doing that. So a typical part for these folks are really to focus on transferring that, taking the payment card information, understanding why they're keeping it, minimize that, and then as part of this, use that as an overall risk management structure to drive security and privacy improvements in the business overall.
To add on to what Tom was saying, which I think is perfect, and coming from a company that actually I'm responsible for PCI compliance because we just launched a consumer product, and that consumer product we're doing the payment processing with an outsourced vendor. So again, getting back to the third-party risk. And then our product actually protects payment card data in some of our customers. So our product has to be PCI certified. So having gone through this on both sides, both as in essence, a processor of credit cards and then a provider of protection to those environments, it's a great way to evaluate it. But I think Tom makes a great point. You have to think about the data minimization, because in some cases the risk is larger because people are just hoarding data without really understanding, do they really need it? And then I think the other thing that I've found, having been assessed from two angles, is that the PCI DSS standards, though good, are not necessarily all that you need to do. You need to think beyond those standards and think that you shouldn't think that just meeting that standard means that you're secure. Because we've seen day in and day out retailers who've had PCI compliance get breached. And so you have to think about it as, in essence, perhaps a minimum standard, but not necessarily the level with which you might need to go to truly manage the risk to your company or the customers you're serving.
Yeah, and I'll add on that because I've heard both, as we talked earlier about auditors versus assessors and what's the difference between them. About 4 or 5 years ago, there's a lot of people that were kind of on the, compliance is the minimal, but security is the goal. But then we'd also say, but there's no such thing as security. And so there's kind of a lot of confusion, I think, of, well, what should we really do? And I think really the term is kind of assurance that we're looking at is when you look at the spectrum, what level of assurance do we have as organizations to make sure that the systems are operating, we know what data we have, and we're not negligent. And that level of assurance includes technology, includes systems, it includes frequencies of assessments, includes internal, external, it includes automated tools. Negligence is you don't look at that and there isn't an understanding of how you're providing that level of assurance. Negligence is not knowing what information you have and not even knowing that it exists out there. The key organization, these cybersecurity programs, is every year there should be higher levels of assurance and higher levels of automation that the information is being identified, protected, and minimized.
There's one more question on this hypo, and Wendy, I want to go back to your cheeseburger example. So how do we avoid the cheeseburger problem here, that a company says, my PCI assessment is coming up soon, and so I'm going on my diet. I've been doing cheeseburgers all year, but now I'm really going to get my house in order for this assessment. How do we avoid a point-in-time assessment being a continual process of eating cheeseburgers and dieting?
Well, if you've ever tried to get somebody else to stop eating cheeseburgers, you know how difficult that is. But part of it is literally that if the business does not see the risk of cybersecurity breach as more substantial than its risk of going out of business, for example, because it's been spending too much money on IT, then it is not going to adopt that new lifestyle. And so it is a fundamental problem of getting businesses not necessarily to understand and agree with the level of risk, but to understand that there's a certain level of due diligence that they need to follow regardless of whether they believe in the risk or not. And that it has to do with, as other panelists have talked about, with obligations to their customers, to their partners, that the business risk is not just theirs to take. So we certainly need to approach it from that perspective.
And
I
just
would
to
agree
add
with-
on, go ahead. I was just say, just to add on to that, one of the big changes that we're seeing now is IT. It's gone from IT risk to company risk to starting to become board level risk. So the National Association of Corporate Directors is looking at 2019, and some of the surveys they found was digital or business transformation and cybersecurity or privacy are two of the top 3 risks that boards have. Don't assume that boards have knowledge around cybersecurity risk. We typically find many boards that have financial or business background, but they're not aware of it. So there's a great opportunity now to make sure that there is the education from vendors, other folks in the industry to come back, and that's a key part that we would encourage everybody to do now is ask how is the organization informing senior management of what cybersecurity risks are happening so that they can make adequate decisions and recommendations and governance processes.
Just to put a number.
To tie back the hamburger and payment card and to tie what Tom said about the
cheeseburger.
Cheeseburger, yes.
Incremental improvement is
Yeah,
the hamburger,
exactly.
getting the cheese off.
But a true story in understanding the risk, to Tom's point, that I had a couple years ago with somebody in the fast food business, that they said their CEO and their board didn't care about cyber risk. And we got into a bit of an argument, and I said, well, what are you talking to them about? And no offense to the PCI and all that stuff, but they were talking to the board about payment card industry standard compliance. And I said, well, no wonder why the board doesn't care. That's a revenue risk. I go, you know, what about the food safety data? You don't own the slaughterhouse, but the only way in which you know the hamburger meat is good is the information flow from the slaughterhouse all the way through the point of sale. What's your cybersecurity program for your food safety data? They didn't have one because they were focused on revenue risk and PCI compliance. And when I told them that if I was some animal rights whack job activist and I could muck with the integrity of that data, I could kill your customers. And I could be an insider or an external person doing that. That was the relevant risk that then got board relevance, that then got them to understand what they needed to do. And what we've got to do is think about not only, again, like I said, the risk to the company, but the risk to the customers, and then put those things together. And then I think, Tom, to your point, when you do that, you will have the right board items. And to what Wendy said, you'll then have the right culture to then figure out how to control for the risk.
In the interest of time, we actually are going to move on to the next hypo. Did you have something that you wanted to say quickly, Garrett?
At one point on that scenario, one of the things I didn't hear was risk quantification, and I hope that as you know, to tie what Tom and Malcolm said with a bow, they are understanding how much data we are storing, and as time goes on, how much sensitive data do I have, and then you can quantify. You know, there's been enough data breaches now. There's enough sources out there to say if you lose this amount of data, here's of this type in this part of the world where these regulatory laws apply, this is how much it'll typically cost you. And I think that back to the point of, you know, data is not only an asset, but it also is a potential liability that people need to start doing that assessment. To Tom's point, you know, is it worth holding on to this credit card that I took from a customer a year ago to pay for a cup of coffee? They're not going to return that cup of coffee. Is it worth the liability of holding it to maybe do some marketing with it or know who they are?
So for our fifth hypo, Company E hires a penetration tester and discovers some significant vulnerabilities in systems that hold customer information, including payment card data. However, the company is going through a difficult financial time. How should the company proceed? I want to start off by asking, should the assessor make its findings regardless of the company's ability to afford to remediate them?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would add absolutely, but it is a consideration. I mean, I think one of the issues that we deal with in cybersecurity is there's this perception, and I think a lot of us have it, that we go around, all we do is we find problems, and we're disconnected from what the business risks are. So while they should definitely report it and management be aware of it, should they immediately patch this? Well, I'm not sure. There might be something else that might be causing. If you think about this from a typical brick and mortar, this would be similar to a toy vendor right now that has a broken window and a door that can't lock in the front. Should they immediately go out and close their shop and get the window and miss all the shopping, or do they take that risk? We don't know. So these are the decisions that people have. So I think the importance from the security or the pen tester here is to be able to translate these vulnerabilities into what the business risks are. So if, in this case, if their system has a bunch of vulnerabilities, but like Malcolm said, it's an older patched system that they decided not to patch and they've implemented some other controls around it, it may not be as appropriate. If it's the other scenario that Troy mentioned, and the system is directly connected to the internet and anybody at any point in time can do this, it's probably something that they should immediately work on. So I think one of the key parts for pen testing or any pen testing organization is to work on what are the recommendations, how do they solve it, and how do you prove that you can come back in and that organization is improving. And then the second part is really asking, how did this get there? What was the root cause analysis? Was this lack of training, lack of awareness? Is it lack of people, resources? All those things come into this. So what I like about penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, a lot of these technical ones that you do is I like to think of their root cause analysis. So going back to the hammer, they're your physical. You're doing your physical with your doctor, and they come in, they tell you where your heartbeat is, your blood pressure, and you have to look at all those things in context to figure out what needs to happen. But the other great part about the doctor is that they tell you, and I saw 20 people today and you're the 20th of 20 in health, that's another good symbol that maybe, your internal perception may not be the appropriate one. So I think really making sure that you understand exactly how that works with other folks is critical.
So going back to the cheeseburger analogy, now we'll add some bacon on it to really raise the stakes. The problem is that from a financial point of view, if you know what the possible impact of a breach is, but you don't believe that it's likely, if you don't believe that it's probable, then your financial calculation is going to be different. So let's say it would cost you $1 million a year to have a security program, and you don't get breached until your second year, and it only costs you $500,000. You came out ahead. So from a purely financial standpoint, it doesn't always make sense for a company to go all out in addressing its security risks if that incurs substantial financial risk. And let's be honest, we cannot say today whether small companies can actually afford the security that we recommend for them, because we can't always say necessarily how much it will cost them. So that's the other complication to this formula. If this company does know about some vulnerabilities, that's not the same thing as saying when the breach is going to happen or whether it's going to happen. So can they buy time while they improve their financial situation and decide they're going to address the vulnerability later? It is a calculation, and it might pay off for them. So that's the other dynamic that we need to address more widely, is that possibility is not probability, and we don't know what the actual cost of security is going to be for some of these smaller businesses, or even the larger ones for that matter.
I know that others want to weigh in, and I want to add something that you might be able to factor into your comments. In your experience, do companies with limited resources tend to shy away from having assessments because of concerns they might have about their financial wherewithal to remediate them?
Yeah, I'll make a couple comments on that one. I think, first of all, it is culture. I think we've alluded to that a few times. I was going to say, we did a survey recently, 10,000 companies responding, saying that only 37% of them feel like their board understands the cybersecurity risk within the organization. So back to board reporting. But here, maybe even at the management level, I think one of the keys that we haven't mentioned is making sure the right people are weighing in on the decision. So leading practice is to have a steering committee, whether it's your data governance committee, your security committee, your privacy, whatever it's called, but some committee of folks that are from the business, from the legal aspect, from the compliance aspect, and from security that are making this decision together. So it's not just the security organization looking at priorities. So this is going to be a matter of priority. Yes, the assessor or the internal CISO or anybody should come up with all the problems, right? So whether it's the heartbeat or the lungs or whatever it is, have the full list, but then you have to prioritize them, and you want to have the right people prioritizing and then looking at the cost benefit of each one.
So I'm going to take probably a controversial view on this. I don't think it's a prioritization problem first, and I think if you start that way, you're going to be trading off and saying, I can't afford it, so therefore you're not going to do it. I come from a basis and a view that innovation comes through starvation. I'm a former finance guy. Look at the total cost of controls. Look at the security controls that are impeding the business velocity. The company's having a financial problem, they probably have solutions in place that are controls in place that are degrading computing performance. There's cost of capital. There's so many ways in which you can look to fund a security solution that's better. And if you start with just going this or that, I don't have the money, so therefore I can't afford this, you're limiting the solution set with which you can innovate around. And that's also the problem I see with a lot of chief information security officers. They don't have the business acumen to look at the entirety of the business and figure out, how do I optimize the business velocity? How do I optimize for the risk? And how do I actually protect to enable the mission of the business? And I think if they frame it that way, they'll have more opportunities to figure out how you do both, improve the financial situation of the company and manage the risk.
I think to add one important part on this, and we've seen this a bunch of times, so I don't think what you said is particularly controversial. I mean, I agree with that. One of the common problems that we found with this is who is the stakeholder of this report and where is it going? So we talked earlier about audit versus assessment and where this goes. If it's an IT or a CISO that's typically hiring a pen tester, they generally, CISOs are generally charged with improving security. They generally don't want to tell their bosses about all the issues they have, right? More mature organizations are able to differentiate that, but it's important to realize that there may be different things that different organizations want to do. So in this case, maybe the right solution is to minimize the IT staff. Maybe the right solution is to outsource vendors. The IT managers are typically not going to do that. So in order to get this digital, this transformation that Malcolm talked about, or this innovation, we have to realize that it may not necessarily be the best interest of the IT or the business or the stakeholders today. So critical parts of these organizations are who's getting the information, where is that going, so that the business can make the right decision of what they need to do, and that may not necessarily be in the best interest of every one of those employees.
And I'll add to this hypo. When we look at this, too often we rush to the technology or the people. And often for organizations that are struggling financially, it really is the process and being able to identify, are we processing payment card data, for example, in a way that is, do we have to spend all this time focused on the security of the infrastructure, or can we be able to turn on encryption? One example of an organization that was struggling financially, they didn't even know that previously, in previous leadership tenure, they had purchased tokenization and were able to, rather than overhaul the infrastructure, which they thought they had to do because there were security flaws in the environment, they were able to devalue the data by just minimizing how they turned and changed the process and changed where the information flowed through their organization, and then started to devalue. I think to the earlier point on the lifestyle that Wendy talked about, I'm starting to get really hungry for lunch all of a sudden. I don't know why. But in so many times we talk about, well, PCI compliance is not enough. And we have to make sure that we understand the PCI practices versus the compliance to a one point in time attestation. So within the standard itself, it's over 200 requirements that are business continuity practices for good security process, and being able to make sure that those security practices continue to be in the environment. The attestation that comes from having an external assessor come in and confirm that these processes are in place, that is a lot of boards like to point to that because it's tangible, it's a piece of paper that they can hold up and say, we met this level of compliance. But the reality of security, and actually of PCI security, is that it's an ongoing process. It's supposed to be part of that lifestyle, so that when you go to have that doctor checkup or that PCI evaluation, it's really just confirmation that these processes you have in place to secure this information have been in place and continue to be in place for some time to come.
So in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the next hypo. And for the next, we have 2 hypos left. And for these, we want to switch gears a little bit and talk about FTC assessments. So under FTC consent orders, companies are required to have biennial assessments. And I'm going to read this hypo and then fold in a question from the audience. Company AA is required by FTC consent order to obtain biennial assessments. The company believes that System X does not contain any consumer personal information covered by the order, so it negotiates with its assessor a scope of work that takes System X out of review. Setting aside legal issues, what are the implications for the assessment process of this carve-out? So I'd like you all to address that question, and we also have a question from the audience that has to do with some assessments that have been submitted to the FTC. And since then, there have been revelations about certain companies' data practices and data disclosures. In hindsight, should the assessor do anything differently given those revelations?
Sure. I'll tackle this. I've gone through this several times in my life. I think the key part in this scenario, or the word that I'd focus on, is the company believes that the system doesn't contain information, right? Belief is probably not a good reason why you would want to change scope or do anything. So the question is, what level of assurance do they have that those systems don't contain information? Right? What tools are they using? What automation? What interviews? There's lots of different techniques. How frequently are they doing that? Was that a one-time thing they did 2 or 3 years ago? So a critical part in scope is to make sure that both the organization and the assessor are working together through interviews, through understanding the environment and where that's at. And they both want to have a high level of assurance. Whereas the assessor comes in with an opinion of somebody that's been working and can identify areas that are likely to contain information, right? Transactions logs or where they've seen some others, but they don't typically know the ins and outs of the organization. In that part, they rely on the organization that they're supporting, in this case, company AA, to tell them how they process what they've done in the past, where they've been these repositories of information. So a critical part is that they do that. As part of that negotiation process, it's not beneficial to have a smaller scope from an assessment perspective, right? It's beneficial to actually have it, but there's not a lot of harm in saying, oh, as part of the engagement, can we look over here or can we test certain information? So part of the limitations is a lot of times in scope tends to be the Achilles heel of a lot of these assessments, is that the scope is incorrect. And in fact, most of the time we look at the scope is incorrect. Malcolm mentioned vendors before. Many of these breaches are around vendors or other points, and what happens is management said, we had no idea. We had no idea that we were at this risk and this data was out there. So I kind of come back to the question that I would ask management in this scenario is, what assurance do they have that their processes are adequate, that they're covering, and that they have the right level of frequency in it? The second part is then once they have that, how are they ensuring that new processes are not being added? So another time as you do these, particularly in a biennial type of assessment, a lot changes in 2 years in technology today. And we talked about with this insurance, one of the biggest challenges is we're trying to guess what the threats, the risks, the technologies are 18 months, 16 months, 24 months. And unlike the financial side where it's not changing all that rapidly, the technology and the risks and the threats are changing exponentially over here. So those are the 2 items that the organizations really to do, is to make sure they're not working through a belief system to contain information, and that as they're working with the assessor to make sure that they understand what the risks are. The last part I would kind of add is many times when we've done these assessments, it's important, and I would encourage organizations to have independent or one-on-one discussions with board level or senior management without the rest of the company there. We've had many of those. We said, while we were technically compliant, what were the issues that you found? And we may have found 11 months of eating a cheeseburger, 2 weeks that technically did something, and maybe by the letter of the law, they technically passed that point in time. How that's written in the report is, the assessor will try to do the best they can, but a lot of times, really, if you just take the assessor and say, hey, what are the top 3 or 4 things you had? Are there things surprising? What are the areas that we should focus on? The assessor should be able to provide that information back, and that's really improving the security of the organization, not just driving compliance.
And the other issue to think about is even if System X doesn't contain that particular consumer personal information covered by the order, and System Y does, System Y may be dependent on or it may be vulnerable to System X. So System X may pose a threat to the system that actually does contain the consumer personal information. So it's not simply a matter of which system, which bucket contains the data, but how do those systems interact, and is one actually potentially vulnerable to the other? And if so, it should remain in scope.
Yeah, I think Wendy and Tom are spot on that. And Tom, I can't agree with you more on the belief. We need to know, right? We have to validate the data that's in scope and where that data sits on systems. And Wendy, to your point, the interdependencies of systems, because if you don't do that, you're going to miss-scope the whole thing.
Carolyn, you have some experience working with FTC assessments. Could you speak to the scope issue and also the issue that the questioner raised about whether revelations post-assessment would lead you to do anything differently with the benefit of hindsight?
Yeah, sure. So I think specifically with the orders, the scope, totally agree with the belief point. I think the assessor should do its own independent validation, because if you're the independent assessor and you're responsible for assessing something that is within the scope of the order, the assessor should know and have its own way of determining if the scope is appropriate. So first of all, the assessor should be independent and skeptical and understand what the company's saying, do its own assessment, then understand if the scope is really appropriate and if System X really should be out of scope based on everything that everybody said. As far as hindsight, I think that's always true, right? In hindsight, things could always be better, and maybe you learned something that you didn't know at the time when you originally did it. I think, the point is that when you're doing the assessment, you're as skeptical as you can be. You're turning over every rock that you can think of. You have a team, so it's not just one person, it's a group of people. You're working with the company, you're working with their external counsel, you're looking at third parties, and you're looking as broadly as possible. Also going back to an earlier hypo, you're looking at what were the external other assessments that were done. Was there a PCI assessment? Was there an attack and penetration? Was there a compromise assessment? So you're looking at all those pieces. And then as you learn something new, for example, these are 2 years long, and as Tom said, a lot changes. So you can still, even within the 2 years, you might look back and say, oh, now I should do this because now I've learned something else. So I think that's always true.
What does that skepticism or, as Tom put it, the level of assurance look like? So is there a sense in which the assessor doesn't want to bite the hand that feeds it? So company AA has hired the assessor to do, this project, and by challenging the parameters of this project, the assessor risks, endangering kind of an ongoing assessment relationship with company AA.
Yeah, certainly a reasonable question, right, when you look at incentives and that kind of thing. But I would say, at least with us, as an independent assessor, we have independent standards that require all this independence. So it's no different than doing a financial audit where we have to be skeptical, right? That's part of having a CPA license, and we'll get our license taken away if we don't do the right thing. So while I understand the point on an incentive, no, it's not a factor, because that's what you're required to do under our standards. We have levels and levels of review. So you have the assessor, you have after that, national offices, other checkers. It goes on up the line. So there's no incentive there to do the wrong thing. It's all about making sure you're as skeptical as possible and asking all the right questions so that you don't miss something, because the assessor is under the gun too, right? The assessor can really be scrutinized. So our our risk is more that we're scrutinized by others than we lose some business.
And I just add, as another part of it, it's about the objectivity of the assessor. So a lot of times with these external organizations, one of the key items is to bring them in early, right? So if you bring people in 6 months or a year before the actual assessment to kind of do a health check or a mid-year check, there can be, that can be one way to mitigate the risk where they're not going to fail, but you can identify some areas. A second part is the communication channel. If there can be a direct channel to like an audit committee on a board or something like that, where they know that they have those open lines of communication and they have a responsibility to communicate with them, there's some ways to do it. What you don't want to do in this scenario is hire an external auditor that is a friend of the IT manager that only reports to the IT manager, right? That would be bad. So when you look at these scenarios, you're kind of looking at what's the objectivity, what's the qualification of the assessors, what level of assurance do I have that they're doing the right level of things and competence, and if you don't feel comfortable with that, you can change, you can rotate, you can bring in different people, you can ask for that. So I think the organization has a responsibility to ensure that the assessor and the assessment process they're going through meets their level of rigor of independence as well.
So we're going to turn to our last hypo for the limited amount of time that we have left for the panel. So company BB has annual PCI DSS audits and biennial FTC assessments required by a consent order. The PCI DSS qualified security assessor and the FTC assessor identify a number of ways in which the company's security has not been consistent with the PCI DSS or the consent order. The company takes corrective actions. What findings should the QSA and the FTC assessor make? So I want to start off by asking how common is this scenario currently on the PCI side and on the FTC side? So let's start with PCI first, and either Troy or Tom may want to weigh in on that.
Sure, I'll start and then I'll pass to Tom because he actually looks at assessments. I'll say from the qualifications itself and the training that we provide to the assessors, and something probably unique about PCI training and for the qualified security assessors, unlike some other security certifications that I have and have had for a long time, we require annual training. And so the training itself is a test that they have to take and pass. And Tom was just talking to me last night about how he loves taking the annual test.
14 years in a row.
But one of the things that we try to emphasize in that every year is there's a lot of changes that happen in these environments. And so there's a need to continually look at how these changes happen. And we've noticed, and we can take the previous forensic data. We work closely with forensic investigators looking at why something may have been missed in the past. So we emphasize that all of that information should be documented. Now, if the organization has taken corrective measures along the way and they have now become in compliance with PCI, then they can submit it to their third parties, whether that's their merchant bank or whether it's another third party looking for assurance that they're doing the right things. The documentation that they receive could be dependent. They could just receive a letter of attestation, meaning that at this point in time, they've corrected those actions, and it is now an environment that should have the process. Again, I have to emphasize that point. It's not just that they've met at one point in time, but they have the processes in place and the technology and people in place to know as this environment evolves, they're going to be able to adjust to the new threat model that continually changes. So the other thing that I would put there is that if they do come to a point where they are addressing issues that cannot be resolved, there are non-compliant PCI reports that do become submitted, and that is at times okay, because an organization might be going through an acquisition. They might be taking on new assets that at the time of their assessment, they've not had an opportunity, that the previous organization was not doing the right things. So being able to identify and organize in a way to say, we identify where the problems are and be able to improve and recognize that we have a mitigation plan for addressing these so that we will become in PCI compliance is an important part of a QSA's job.
Yeah, and so I think from the boots on the ground side, what we've seen is it would be unusual today if after an FTC consent to something that a year later that there are significant PCI challenges. As Troy said, usually what we will find is there will be significant progress, and depending on the environment, they may or not have made it 100% in a year, depending on the complexity of the organization, but there should have definitely been significant progress. And that's the important part, is that once they have the roadmap to demonstrate that they're making progress, working through that and being transparent with the organizations that they're working with of what they've done, what they've missed, what they haven't, is really key. The biggest mistakes that we found is there's this feeling that of transparency is not good, keeping everything in-house and then managing or trying to manage the message on the back. That's a very poor way of doing it. The second big trend that we see now is, and we used to deal with this in the government, and we do FSMA assessments, this kind of idea. We used to call it a credit and forget it mentality, that you get through the process and everyone forgets about it, and 3 years later you do another FSMA assessment. On the PCI one, that's a big challenge we're seeing right now, is once people get through and they think that they've gotten a green rock or compliant report on compliance, all of a sudden management goes or the organization goes and they redirect all those resources that they had, and you find that they immediately go back to the way they were at. So once organizations get to that class or they've done the corrective item, a key item is to ensure they've got the right processes to maintain that moving forward, and that's where you can look at governance, you can look at technology, all those items to make sure that you continue to manage it.
And I think on the FTC side, one of the good points of the order is that it does require the full 2 years of disclosure. So every exception that's found within the 2 years should be reported to the FTC, even if it's been remediated. So that's the point, is to say, well, for the first 6 months, there was an exception, then the company remediated, and for the last 18, there was not one. So it's full disclosure over the 2 years of what was every exception. Then those should also be aggregated to say, how does this compare to what the requirements in the order are? Is this enough to say that the company didn't comply, or this is a qualified report? And there are plenty of those, right? There's always exceptions. I'm sure that's true in PCI as well. Nobody's perfect. No company can get this straight all the time. But I think the key is disclosing every single one, making sure the company has a remediation plan for everyone, and then looking at them in the aggregate to see what they mean compiled together.
And I also think in some cases those exceptions could be because there's a better control. Because in some cases these standards are written towards controls that are dated, that we know don't work. So you also have to understand that and then see the compensating controls analysis to see in aggregate then, have they been consistent with the order? And they made a choice to not follow a particular defined static technology approach that was defined in the standard and do something better. And so, again, we have to open that up to the potential so that people, again, getting back to my comment, can innovate towards better solutions and better controls.
So unfortunately, we have reached the end of our time for this panel. I want to thank all of the panelists for a great discussion. We covered a lot of territory, and we really appreciate the viewpoints that you presented. We'll now be taking a break for 10 minutes. We will resume at 11:15 with a fireside chat on emerging data security threats with FTC Commissioner Rebecca Kelly-Slaughter and Josh Korman.
So welcome back to the FTC's data security hearing. Next up on the agenda is a fireside chat on emerging security threats between FTC Commissioner Rebecca Kelly-Slaughter and security expert Joshua Corman. Rebecca Kelly-Slaughter was sworn in as a Federal Trade Commissioner on May 2, 2018. Prior to joining the commission, she served as chief counsel to Senator Charles Schumer of New York, the Democratic leader, advising him on legal, competition, telecom, privacy, consumer protection, and intellectual property matters, among other things. Joshua Korman, the Chief Security Officer at PTC, is probably best known as the co-founder of the I Am the Cavalry security organization. He has also served as the director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative for the Atlantic Council, CTO for Sonatype, director of security intelligence for Akame, and in senior roles for the 451 Group and IBM Internet Security Systems. I'll turn it over now to Commissioner Slaughter and Joshua Korman.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Lisa. And
we have a fire.
Yeah, we have our fire here, appropriately digital. And thanks, Josh, for being here. So let's start with a little bit on your background, and particularly, why don't you tell us a little bit about I Am the Cavalry?
Oh, sure. So the name is both wonderful and terrible, but I had been researching the rise of hacktivism and anonymous, and I think many of us in the cybersecurity profession get into it because we want to be a protector. We want to do things that matter. And what I started getting tension on is we're so focused on what's right for our shareholders or our enterprise or our single organization that we forget that there's public trust, there's public safety, national security issues. And when I saw the rise of hacktivism and anonymous, I started turning my eye towards the things that no one was paying attention to. And I kept naively thinking if I could build my credibility and get into the intelligence community or into Congress or White House and just get the right message to the right person, the right adult in the room, they'd go fix our problems. And we did that. We got in as high and deep as you can get. We brought 5 hackers into Fort Meade for 2 days with General Alexander. We had the conversations, and what we realized is the cavalry isn't coming. No one's gonna save us. And that moment was both devastating and empowering, because if you know no one's gonna come, it really challenges you to say, what am I willing and able to do? So it took about 6 months later at DEF CON, the largest hacker conference in the world, we kind of did a plea to the hacker community and said, our dependence on connected technology is growing a lot faster than our ability to secure it, especially in areas affecting public safety and human life. So you can either scream in the darkness and keep being a pointing finger at past failure, or we could try something new. Let's lead with empathy, let's be ambassadors and translators, let's be a helping hand towards future success. And it was basically a call to arms that said, if you want to be part of the solution, if you want to try something new, if you want to work together, you personally say, I am the cavalry, and then donate your time or research to it. We just turned 5 years old. We've done significant outreach into Food and Drug Administration, into Congress, into White House, internationally. And we tried to be that voice of technical literacy, an ambassador and translator from all the knowledge in the private sector research community into safety critical industries.
So can you give us an example of what that would mean in practice?
So we had Jay Radcliffe, a diabetic who was hacking his own medical devices, insulin pumps. He was convinced the FDA didn't care, that people would have to die first, and just didn't know how to connect that truth as a patient and as a researcher into policy reform. And we said, look, how about instead of just beating your head against the wall, let's try a different approach. Let's use our social skills. And so we built trust. We did engagement. We looked at this as a campaign versus fixing a single flaw in a single device. And through that cross-education, we built deep trust with Dr. Suzanne Schwartz at FDA. They taught us how regulation works. We taught them how researchers do things and why. And fairly quickly, in the grand scheme of things, they started putting a lot more technical literacy into their pre-market approval. They then did the first safety communication in history on a bedside infusion pump that was vulnerable but unpatchable, which is a story we might get back to. And started just really treasuring the value of coordinated vulnerability disclosure and started incentivizing medical device makers to do it. Are we done? No. But have we had material impact on turning up the cyber hygiene of the medical device cyber supply chain? Absolutely.
So I've been around Washington government policymakers for a while, and over the last 5 years that you described, I Am the Cavalry being up, and even for the time before that, one might say there's been a change. I think hacker used to be a dirty word in government circles. Do you think that that's still true?
I think it's absolutely changing. Hacker equals criminal for a while. Now, I just watched a testimony from Art Manion from CERT-CC in the Senate, and both the chairman and the ranking member both implicitly acknowledged the value of coordinated vulnerability disclosure and working with security researchers, and we're giving a hard time to Intel for not embracing it well enough, right? And it's not that it was a single day where the worm turned. What we tried to do, instead of just saying hacking is First Amendment protected free speech, or we don't like CFAA, we tried to show we can play a unique role in driving public safety in cars, medical devices, et cetera. And when we'd have that conversation towards the end, they would say, well, how can we help? And we said, well, for one thing, there's a chilling effect on researchers because of CFAA and DMCA. So we created a body of proof of the value we could demonstrate to public safety and national security, in parallel with some great work from Katie Mazuris and Art Manion on standards and anti-remit tuition and the DMCA exceptions. But in general now, several parts of the US government have published disclosure programs. The FDA encourages and rewards having it in medical devices. I myself used a template that we designed with US Commerce Department and NTA. It's becoming something where not only is it acceptable to embrace hackers, it's actually encouraged.
Well, let me flip the other side of the coin. As much as government has been distrustful of hackers as criminals, I think the hacker community hasn't always seen government as their best friend or allies. Do you think that side is changing too?
It fluctuates. DEF CON turned 25 last summer, not this past one, but prior. We brought 2 sitting congressmen, Will Hurd of Texas and Jim Langevin of Rhode Island, to DEF CON on stage. And the reception was quite good. And yet there was still a backlash because, of the arrest of Marcus on some of the past hacking things. So it's an ebb and flow of trust and distrust. The hacker community is not inherently a fan of government. They think government can only make things worse. And as such, the cavalry gets criticism quite a bit for engaging and reaching into these areas.
Let me pivot a little bit and sort of zoom out on the conversations that we're having here at the FTC and in the public generally. We throw around a lot of terms: privacy, security, safety. How do you think about each of those different terms, either together or separately?
Well, for anyone who's been watching the content over the last 2 days, it's still very difficult to even separate privacy from security. So adding a third thing of safety, or cyber safety as we've been calling it, is challenging. One of the ways I do this is indirectly. I tell my neighbor I love my privacy. I'd like to be alive to enjoy it. Because I think you can if you just want to solve for privacy, you can encrypt something. If you want to solve for privacy, safety, and security, you may design the system differently. You may have fewer things. You may have less attack surface. And if we ever sub-optimize for just one objective, we're going to be making trade-offs and robbing Peter to pay Paul. Now, some of these things will be zero-sum, but I think narrow solutions actually work counter to our collective interests. So when I think about they are partially overlapping Venn diagrams without drawing a picture. One of the ways I put this in healthcare, I was on the Congressional Task Force for Healthcare Cybersecurity, and they wanted us to focus on preserving HIPAA intent in the precision medicine era. And I talked to a whole bunch of chief medical officers. I said, you guys have more incentive to have a corpse with their privacy intact than invest in security that provides reliable, available patient care. And no one disagreed. Right? So our incentives incentivize things. I hope they're incentivized the right things. And instead of having an encrypted database on a device, let's make sure it has less attack surface.
That is a chilling example to think about. And I want to use that chilling example to pivot to some other chilling examples of some large-scale attacks and breaches that we've heard about in the public. Can you talk about some examples of publicly known attacks and the lessons that you think we can draw from them?
Yeah, and these 3 won't surprise anyone, but maybe the talking points are slightly different. Chronologically, WannaCry is the one that scared me the most, but chronologically, Mirai is a real gut check for us, and I think I was thinking about it most of yesterday.
Let me back you up. Can you just, for people who aren't intimately familiar with the details, can you give an overview?
So there were 3 attacks. The Mirai botnet was mostly low-cost, $100-ish IoT internet-connected cameras that took down the internet for a day just before the last presidential election. The WannaCry attack happened on Mother's Day weekend 2 years ago now, I'm saying. And it took out 40% of the UK's healthcare delivery for a weekend. It had some isolated impact on the US. And NotPetya was a nation-state attack from Russia against Ukraine that escaped its blast radius and did significant damage to Maersk Global Shipping, about 20% of global shipping. Merck Pharmaceuticals had $870 million damage, including contributions to our national security supply of vaccines. This is designated US critical infrastructure. So that one attack of NotPetya did more damage than a hurricane. We now have single attacks with collateral damage exceeding those of a hurricane. So those 3 attacks, I think, should be policy game changers, but for slightly different reasons on each.
So tell us a little bit about why and whether you see any of them or all of them as preventable or should be preventable.
So in the case of Mirai, real quickly, these cameras had 3 defining characteristics. And they were internet reachable, they had a fixed hard-coded password, and they were unpatchable. So I said an unpatchable device is like the lawn darts of the internet. It's just inherently unsafe. In no world should that be okay. The collective might of those to be wrapped up in a botnet. I used to work at Akamai. That was the largest botnet we'd ever seen for denial of service attack. It was only using 20% of its population and only sending about 20% of the traffic. So a 20th of a 20th was still too big, took out the internet for a day. So one of the things I think there is interesting is those 3 characteristics I just described are most medical equipment. They're internet reachable, fixed passwords, or if you change them, you void your maintenance contract, and a lot of these are unpatchable. So those 3 things, I think they were scary to public policymakers, including myself, because prior to that, we had said if we simply add more transparency and information to enable free market choice, then a rationally self-interested actor will act in their own self-interest. The whole information asymmetry thing, we're going to dampen that with more data, and then they'll buy the right things. The problem with this is the seller of that $100 camera is not incentivized to make it safer. The buyer of that camera is not incentivized to make it safer. It's the externalities in the tragedy of the commons where other people were hurt, and that other people might be a loss of revenue for Spotify or Netflix or Amazon. It could be a denial of service on several hospitals. So to me, that one scares us because it shows that if there isn't some minimum hygiene or 7 deadly sins you cannot do and ride the internet, some minimum burden, irrespective of the size of your device or the size of your company, then the collective harm can shatter trust in public faith in these institutions, right? Institutional trust, as Kirsten said yesterday.
I want to put a pin in that thought about collective harm and just give you a chance to walk through the other 2, WannaCry and NotPetya.
So in the case of WannaCry, what you had is a known vulnerability that Microsoft fixed. In fact, it was such a serious one, they fixed it in Windows XP. Now Windows XP is end of life. Its successor, Windows Vista, is end of life. And its successor, Windows 7, is now on extended support. So we're multiple generations old on this. It's not going to be, I'm not going to be Marie Antoinette and say, let them eat cake and get off XP. But they actually issued a patch for this in March. 2 months later, in May, an attack, a very badly written ransomware, not targeting hospitals, did significant harm because most of the UK hospitals, most hospitals writ large, were exposed to that vulnerability to the naked internet.
Why, if there was a patch out there?
People don't patch. People aren't incentivized to patch, or they don't have the resources to patch. And what we have is we've gotten drunk on the benefits of connectivity, but we haven't understood the responsibility that comes with that. I had a lot of debates during the task force of, they said, well, we can't afford it. We don't have any money. And I flippantly said, if you can't afford to protect it, then you can't afford to connect it. Like I might want to drive a tractor trailer. I might want to fly a 747. I might want to do open heart surgery. I am not qualified to do so. And if I want to, there's a burden I need to accomplish to demonstrate that I can do that safely. And what we've done is we like the benefits of the convergence of physical and digital, but we have not yet internalized the costs of doing so.
Okay, so let's stick on this for a second and talk about that small hospital with these devices or the operating systems that maybe aren't patched. When you say if you, what did you say? If you can't afford to protect it, you can't afford to connect it. Does that mean we shouldn't have small hospitals? What does that mean?
And I intend to get to some practical advice here,
Yeah.
but it's about, one of the core beliefs in the cavalry is that we are over-dependent on undependable things. And when you put it that way, you have 2 choices. You can depend less, which means a retreat, or you can make them more dependable, which takes will, money, time, political, public policy change, and is slower. So what we're really looking to do is right-size the risk and expose the true costs of these dependencies. Where it's acceptable, keep doing it. Where it's not, do something practical. So in the case of hospitals, it may not be that they can wholesale replace all their bedside infusion pumps, but it might be that when they buy the next tranche of them, they can buy one that's patchable. They can buy one that has a coordinated disclosure program. It may cost the same as one that doesn't. But what we're trying to do is nudge them from a prone state to a less prone state. If they're stuck with it for the next 5 years, it may mean disable the wireless capability and use it as a pump as it originally was intended instead of as a hyper-connected, hyper-exposed one. It could be compensating controls, but this nihilism that we can't do it perfectly, so let's not do it at all, we're absorbing significant and growing risk.
Okay, and the last one was NotPetya, so can you talk about that a little bit?
And NotPetya is really scary because that's, a nation-state level adversary. Russia attacked the MEDOX software, accounting software in Ukraine. It escaped its intended blast radius, and any businesses having a satellite office in Ukraine got hit. This included Maersk, which is global shipping, about 20%.
So go back again for the non-technophiles among us. When you say escaped its intended blast radius, how did that happen?
They were trying to attack Ukrainian companies. It happened to leak to the global footprint of Merck Pharmaceutical.
Because of internet?
A single office the entanglement of IT, right? So you drop a bomb in the real world, it hits the bomb target and maybe people in the vicinity of the blast radius. You drop a cyber bomb, cyber munition, and it could ripple across the entire planet in ways that were not intended.
So then let's go back to this one. So Merck.
It hit Maersk, Merck, FedEx, a bunch of companies. One of the ones that no one talks about is Nuance, which is voice-to-text dictation, which is a near monopoly in hospitals for doctor notes and doctor orders. So doctor orders were lost or delayed, and we know that delayed and degraded patient care can affect outcomes for time-sensitive procedures. So that was a multi-week outage for a near monopoly in healthcare. So there was absolutely a calculable impact of that particular attack. And what I think that one shows us is how entangled IT systems are. So we talk about, even today, we talked about a small organization, a medium organization, a large organization, as if the size of the organization is the thing to focus on. Perhaps it's not the size of the organization or the size of the device, but maybe the size of the harm or potential for harm that matters most. And it could be this tiny little and unimportant, accounting software mostly sold to one country can hit designated US critical infrastructure in the form of pharmaceutical manufacturing.
So how do we think about that? We have a lot of conversations, we've heard them here and in other places about what are the free market incentives, how do businesses balance the incentive for security and competing incentives that they have. What's your view about how that should be done?
I don't want to butcher Malcolm this morning, but he had a nice way of putting this. I think too much of the conversation is on what's right for my publicly traded company or my shareholders. Of course, that's one of our optimums. That's the private sector optimum. But when we talk about public-private partnerships, the reason we have a public sector, among many, is there are things that are not in the private interest, but are in the collective public interests, and that's where we need it. So I think he called it what's right for shareholders, what's right for customers, and what's right for greater society. I like the way Eli Sugarman says this at Hewlett Foundation. He says there are things in terms of the public-private partnership cliche we talk about. He says there are things the public sector can't do, but the private sector won't do. And I think we forget there's a large and growing list of things that fall on the floor. And for that, he thinks that's the role of philanthropy and altruism. And I think that's one of the vacuums the cavalry's filled. Now, we don't want to own this. What we want to do is be the error handling routine that says, when it falls between the cracks of private local optimum and a public sector policy thing that we don't have the stomach for yet, or there's tensions, or we want to be methodical, how do we quickly triage and decide which things go where so that we can get moving?
So I want to come back to what the public sector should do. Let's focus a little bit in the constructive advice giving way first on, let's talk about the individual consumer. You're talking about some very large scale challenges across big industries and often businesses that don't have any direct consumer relationship or vulnerabilities that don't have any direct consumer relationship. So what should we as individuals be doing to help promote not only our own security, but the sort of global collective security?
So, indirect answer, hackers tend not to like government. So I sometimes sound like I'm pro policy or pro-regulation, I think it's the worst possible idea except all others. In general, my philosophy on this, and I think it's a shared one, a growing one, is in general, free markets fix themselves when you have an informed buyer or demand meeting sufficient supply. Where it breaks down is really two things, and I think we have both here. One is information asymmetry, where I don't have enough information to act in my own self-interest. And to that end, some of the advice is the consumers don't yet know this, but we should start demanding more transparency, more information about security capabilities, primitives, or commitments, which I can enumerate. But in general, adding more information, like before we had Carfax, we knew that I might be sold a lemon. So we had lemon laws to dampen the effects of information asymmetry economically. So I've been pushing a lot for transparency, for labeling, for patching commitments.
How do we make that digestible and comprehensible to the individual consumer who may not understand what it means to have a hard-coded password or any of those other issues?
So some of it has to be abstracted. You and I might not know the difference between a 3-star crash-rated car and a 4-star, but we know a 4-star is better. So there are ways to abstract this. That's part of the role of the private sector, the public policy makers.
Do you think that like third-party validators have a helpful role to play in that?
They could. We have to look for the right thing and the things that can maintain or preserve confidence. And to Sasha's point yesterday, a lot of our advice is really bad. So we don't want to be looking at prescriptive controls or, are you updating your DAT files for AV every day? What we want to be looking for is, these are complex systems. So the failure is going to be frequent. Are you prepared for failure? One way the cavalry did this is on our first birthday, we launched a 5-star cyber safety framework. We did a similar thing called the Hippocratic Oath for connected medical devices, and it's 5 postures towards failure. They have fancy names, but I'm going to cut past those. We said, since all systems fail, these things will be hacked. How do you avoid failure? How do you take help avoiding failure without suing the helper? How do you capture, study, and learn from failure? Have a prompt and agile response to failure and contain and isolate failure? And this was really just saying, we're going to have hacked cars, but when they hack the stereo, can they shut off the brakes? So we've been encouraging things like have a disclosure program, be patchable, avoid some of the dirty sins like hard-coded passwords, things that are obviously bad every day, twice on Tuesdays. And we currently lack the political will to do that. So back to consumers, I think it's flippant to say consumers should do the following things because they really can't act in their own self-interest yet. But what they can start to do is start asking for or rewarding with their wallet people who are more transparent, who do have some of these primitives, who will say, we are patchable and we commit to patching for the next 3 years. When you go to buy your next home router, right now, which one's safer? I'm not sure I could tell. Yeah. I'd like to be able to tell, and maybe slowly, as we see more attacks, people will act with their wallets. But the other problem is, the tragedy of the commons is the other breakdown, which is even if I act in my own self-interest and buy the one that fits the purpose for me, I can still hurt others. And to that end, I think those are the minimum hygiene things we need some public policy on.
Well, that is a very good segue to the next question I wanted to ask, which is that these hearings generally are an opportunity for us to think critically about our own efforts here at the FTC and the legal landscape in which we are operating. I don't want to put you on the spot to say what the FTC should be doing differently under current law or what the laws need to change. So I will zoom out a little bit and say, in an ideal world, what would be the role of public policy? What would be the role of an agency like the FTC? Should we be setting out best practices? Should we make those legally enforceable? How should we be engaging with the hacker and security community? What burden should the government put on companies to sort of raise this bar? Generally, how do you think the world should look?
I'd like to give you a flippant answer. I have tremendous empathy for the role we're in and the point in history we're in. And there's a fine line here. I was thinking about this last night pretty hard. NTIA, Commerce Department, tried to come up with voluntary best practices for labeling for patchability. And we had a whole bunch of private sector engagement, and we came up with a label that said, we commit, our product is patchable and we commit to patching it for this many years. And towards the end, people said, there's no way in hell I'm signing up for that because then the FTC is going to use it against me for fraudulent claims if I change my mind, if I find a library I can't update. So there's a bit of a catch-22 here where we want to encourage more transparency for free market choice in parts of this overall approach, but not use it as a gotcha later for the also necessary law enforcement type enforcement end. To me, I've always looked at, as a layperson, my hope, since I don't know your business and your value levers. But my hope was, it looks like you really have two major things you can do. One is you've already done a few times, which is punish people for fraudulent claims. The TrendNet camera comes to mind. Like, you can't say it's secure and then not be secure. I think the response from private sector to that, though, is don't make any claims, which I think hurts my other goal of transparency and actionable information. So that's a fine line. The other one, though, I think is interesting if you want to play fast and loose with some of the experimentation, what would be bold. And if you don't, if you're passing known vulnerabilities onto your customer, if you're not equipping them with a software bill of materials that allows them to know any vulnerabilities in their product, if you're not patchable, these things may undermine someone's ability to defend themselves at all. So there's a shared responsibility between the producer of a goods and the operator or owner of a good. And in a lot of these cases, those risks are being blindly passed on. So I always thought through the broad interpretation of consumer protection, there could be some minimum transparency or capabilities that are just considered negligent below a certain line, whether it's defined by FTC or simply enforced as a de facto standard. I'd like to see something where it's not about did you pass a regulatory compliance thing with 116 controls, but are these things beyond the pale? Like, you were compromised because of a fixed unchangeable password, or you sold a device that was hackable but not patchable. Picture a different world where it's patchable, you've supplied the patch but the operator didn't use it. That's on them, right? And I can see a world where we've properly placed the risk burden on those in the best place to avoid risk. And that's going to be a bit more about defining what those unforgivable sins are on the bottom end, the floor.
Well, I think we have just a couple more minutes, so I'm going to offer you the opportunity to get in anything that is important to share that I didn't get to ask you about, but also articulate my view that I think this ongoing dialogue between the government and the folks in the best position to understand real security issues on the ground is going to be critical to our ability to address them.
The optimist in me says we're getting pretty close to critical mass. I'm not advocating for any one of these particular policy moves, but if you squint, there's a few common things. There was a Senator Warner bipartisan bill on IoT hygiene. It said you must be patchable, you shouldn't have hard-coded passwords, you should have a disclosure program inviting researchers without suing them, you should use standards-based crypto, and you should be free of quote-unquote known vulnerabilities. Those are the avoidable harms, right? Elective risk, preventable harm. It got winnowed down to maybe 3 things: be patchable, don't have hard-coded passwords, and have a disclosure program. The UK government has a code of practice with 16 things, including those 5. And the GCHQ said these shouldn't be voluntary. These should be purchasing requirements for the country. Out of nowhere, the state of California passed an IoT law saying it should have reasonable practices that are fit for purpose for the device, but the only one they called out is fixed credentials and passwords. So I think and hope we're getting close to some sort of minimum hygiene, because that little device that has a hard-coded password and can't be remediated can do significant harm, maybe to internet cats and maybe to hospitals. And I think if we aren't smart, this is going to be the asbestos of our time, right? We put asbestos everywhere. It's cheap, fire retardant. You'd be an idiot not to use it. But then when you look at mesothelioma and different cancers and the eventual unseen costs, I think what we're going to look at is we should only connect things we can afford to responsibly secure and connect, not just to the person making the device or the person consuming the device, but to these institutions, because to punctuate what we said yesterday, we have to preserve the confidence of the public, the institutional trust. And to tie this to my PTC role, I guess, in the last seconds here, one of the reasons I went from a cavalry public policy role into the private sector is I saw that this software was in medical devices, in factories, in high-speed rail and aviation. And I realized there's a shared responsibility here that even if I do everything right to secure my products, if my medical device makers don't take my patches, people get hurt. And even if they take them and apply these patches, if the hospital doesn't apply the patches, people get hurt. And there's a relay race where many of us have to change the way we do business, and none of us yet have internalized that. And if we're still having an argument about what's right for shareholders, we're not thinking about what's right for public safety and national security. And the true failure is any crisis of confidence in the public to trust these otherwise superior innovations in markets.
Well, that is both very important and very dead on the time that we have. So I really appreciate your thoughts you're sharing with us today. And I strongly encourage you and I'm the cavalry and your fellow hacktivists to continue that dialogue, because I think there are willing and eager ears in the government now, and having our part in that shared responsibility program is really important to me personally. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to say thank you both to Commissioner Slaughter and to Joshua Corman for that interesting perspective. We are now going to take a lunch break. We will be back here at 1 o'clock. We have two interesting panels this afternoon, the first on the U.S. approach to data security, and the second on FTC enforcement of data security.